is the Metropolitan Council Committee of the Whole. I'm Charlie Zelli, Chairman. Welcome. And I appreciate Councilmember Chambliss for chairing last meeting 2 weeks ago. I listened to it because of my deep interest, and I appreciate your chairing it. It's nice to be home and nice to see all of you. I know that we arranged for today to be an informational session and to both hear on the subjects of the Blue Line Extension Capital Grant Agreement, the Green Line Extension Framework for Funding the Gap, and our Transit Advancement Policy, and then any other issues that people here in the council would like to have addressed. And it's nice that we have the time to do that. But first, and I assume that agenda is approved, we have the minutes from the last Committee of the Whole, which was August 16th. So if there is a motion and a second to approve those minutes.
So moved. Second.
Thank you, thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, those minutes are approved. And we have one presenter who I believe is going to give us a PowerPoint to go into it in some depth, and that is Nick Thompson. And Nick just left the room. No, he's coming back.
You don't get out.
Theatrical entrance. Nick, welcome.
Chair and council members, thank you for the opportunity to follow up from our discussion from a couple weeks ago. My name is Nick Thompson, Deputy General Manager, Capital Programs, and we'll be talking about a series of items tonight. Maybe. Oops, there we go. So after the last meeting, we asked for what types of questions you would like discussed tonight. And so I kind of grouped the questions that we received into a couple areas. There are a lot of questions regarding our forecasted budget overall with our new revenue sources that we have for our region and how that applies to both Green Line and Blue Line. Some discussion about the Green Line extension itself. I thought it would be good to recap our settlement agreement process that we've gone through with our contractors as we've extended or increased the budget, extended the time for it, and then the funding agreement for Hennepin County. Several questions. Of course, the item we were discussing 2 weeks ago was around the Blue Line Capital Grant Agreement and the funding for that. So there was a lot of questions in general about the Blue Line. So I have a couple slides about that. And then, of course, this is all within the framework of the Transitway Advancement Policy, and so there were some questions around that policy, enterprise risks, how those risks were set, and questions around that. So trying to cover those topics today. We've kind of developed this in response to many of the questions we received, but of course, if we miss any of those questions or it prompts other ones, that's what our time is about today. So let's talk first about the new revenue source. So this was a historic, has been mentioned, historic legislative session that brought, for the first time, a really strong new sustainable revenue source for regional transportation to our region with the sales tax. And I think this is information we've shared somewhat before with you, but just a reminder of how important this new revenue source is. It's a 7-county sales tax. Divided up, and I'll talk about a little bit about what was prescribed within that and how that applies to our projects. But of the sales tax, 17% will go to the 7 counties in a formula, and 83% to the Metropolitan Council. Of that 83%, it's divided 95% for transit, controlled by the council, and 5% goes to be directed by TAB for active transportation. And so really, a lot of what we'll be talking about in our budget and information as it pertains in questions tonight is around that 95% sale of the 83% that comes to the council for investment in growing our transit system and maintaining and making a great system. So what is that revenue forecast? tonight, we're a little bit early for us to talk to you about forecasts and the budget. So we're ahead of the budget cycle. So there isn't, not all the questions around budget I can answer tonight because that is really coming to you in the next several weeks. Our finance group and leadership, council leadership, they're working on what's in that budget and what the forecasts are and how it's allocated. So I can talk a little bit about it, but there's more to come on the budget in the coming weeks, and I'll talk about the schedule for that. But roughly that amount of new revenue coming to the Council for Transit Investment, that 95% is around, we're estimating maybe around $400 million next calendar year. We'll be assuming that that is a stable source of funding that grows over time, which is really what we've been looking for as a region, is a good stable source. We'll be assuming a 3% growth rate in our forecast. Though that's a really conservative assumption in growth rate based on history, but it's a good place to start in our first year, learning how to budget for this new revenue source. With the legislation, there was some, as it pertains to Southwest LRT, there was one element, one restriction on that sales tax, and that it cannot be used for Southwest or a Green Line extension until the Metro Governance Task Force has completed their work at the end of next June. So, part of what we'll discuss in the funding agreement, that issue is, restricts sales tax as a source for the project. But really, the sales tax will be used for South Green Line extension in the operations phase, which is coming in 2027 and beyond. So that restriction is not too big of an issue related to Green Line extension. So with the sales tax, there are new commitments to the council that we need to be aware of. The council is now 100% responsible for the operating costs of our transitways. Prior to this session, generally, we were cost sharing operating costs with the counties that the transitways were located in. Of course, there's a few caveats with that. It was originally 50% for the council, 50% or state, and 50% for counties. Over time, that 50-50 split after fares had kind of evolved, where the council was, through using federal and state sources, was growing beyond 50%. But now there's clear direction that this is a council responsibility, 100%. And so, and the sales tax is to be used for that. So there's a viable funding source for that. There's a lot of benefits for the council being 100% responsible for operations. Metro Transit and the council can make the operating decisions about how much service and hours and where the service should go, and has a funding source for that. So it's a change, but the council was given funding to meet that change. Legislatively, they also clarified that the council is responsible for capital maintenance costs of transitways. That was not fully, that was a huge risk we had going into session, that we had identified for years, that we didn't have a good funding source to fully maintain our transitways that we were either had built or were building. And now we have a funding source, sales tax, and our federal funding, and to really maintain our transitways in the long term in a good state of good repair, to replace our fleet needed for those transitways and maintain our facilities in great condition. So, but what the legislation did is clarify that that is a council responsibility, and that was unclear necessarily before this session. I believe we will be showing to you as we bring through the budget cycle, really, that we are expecting that our forecasted revenue sources will cover our capital maintenance costs over the time horizon that we are looking at over 30 years. Capital maintenance, one of our big risks within the near term in the next 30 years was a source to replace our light rail vehicles as they've reached their end of life. We knew that was a big risk. We knew what years those risks were going to occur. We didn't have a source for those, and now we can say we have a source to replace our vehicles on the schedule that we want, that is the best schedule for maintaining the fleet in such a good repair for our customers. And so I fully expect that we will be able to maintain our capital projects and transitways in a state of good repair and replace our fleet as needed based on this revenue forecast.
Mr. Chair,
go ahead,
just one clarification. So Nick, is this everything that we've got programmed currently that's coming through our transportation plan or does this, for the next 30 years, assume the other projects that will be in the pipeline that we know aren't yet approved or ready to move into the next phase at the council? Is this what we have currently? Is this,
Sure.
does it include things that are in a pipeline and not here yet? Just what's the scope of this?
Mr. Chair, council members, that's a great question. This scope is the, essentially the projects of our Metro Vision. So that is the transitways that are in the adopted transportation policy plan. Should there be new projects that come through a pipeline that are not specified in the policy plan, a new rail corridor somewhere or something, it does not include something that has not been in an adopted plan or through a planning process. And so, but they, as if a new project were to develop in the next decade, we'd be able to say whether we can afford that or not ability to forecast. So it's not just the transitways we have and not the ones we're just building, it's the ones we plan to build over the next decade. So it's that Metro Vision is what this forecast will have.
And Mr. Chair, just a point of clarification. I know we have a lot of ground to cover. So, for example, if there's a corridor right now where locals are coming together, it's starting to pick up a little bit of steam. And as we look regionally, we know there are some areas that I think somebody referred to on the council as a transit desert where we need to really get in and work with local partners. Those might not yet be anticipated in this funding, but for the things that we have that have been mapped out or we know are operating certainly, but things that are still coming online, those will be covered.
Mr. Chair, Councilman, correct. The ones that we know about are covered within this. And even in our basic bus service, we assume growth in that service. We don't assume where that service is going to go. But there's growth in this beyond, for some of the basic service where maybe there isn't service transit deserts today. There's even some of that within there. But a major new transit way that is not, hasn't went through and into our transportation policy plan is not. We haven't forecasted that. We wouldn't necessarily know what to forecast in terms of what mode it is, what alignment, what year it would open. But if that came too, we'd be able to tell you whether we have enough revenue to incorporate that into a plan. So that's a big change too.
And I
Thank
think
you.
part of this is the process of our looking forward, maybe 10 years, maybe longer, that we have now a source of recurring revenue that's increasing. We have costs, like capital maintenance costs, that needs analysis. There's other options that we will be able to consider. One is how we finance capital maintenance, perhaps going forward, as we look at this vision of our transit, which goes beyond what is currently programmed, including future ABRTs, microtransit. And I think your point is there still room to provide for some of those initiatives? And I would submit there is, to the extent we have this excess funds that we're able to leverage, in addition to some of the funding that is coming to the counties, specifically programmed toward transit. So we think about some of our partners also have resources, including the legislature, which has looked favorably on our past ABRT projects with bonding. So I think there'll be multiple sources, including federal sources, that might become to bear as we think and we consider a robust transit vision for the future. So we're not precluded only by our currently now robust as it is revenue stream.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Mr. Chair and others, we'll be talking a little about that in a few slides to come too, about
Did I
where
jump
that can be
ahead? That's
considered.
okay.
A good preview. So the other source for the regional sales tax, the legislature directed that it had to go towards 13 spending areas. Now, these are areas, a lot of these areas are ones we absolutely have been in our budget before. The legislature does not say how much we need to spend in any of these 13 categories, but does say we need to use the sales tax for these. And so our 2024 budget that you will see in the coming weeks will include spending in all 13 areas tied to the sales tax. And some of these are just for improvements to our existing system. Some of them are for planning for expansion to the system, and others are for maintaining the system. And so this is another area where there'll be a lot of decisions and ability to input of how much to invest in each of these areas. But really, the sales tax will be going towards these areas in addition to the operating costs for transitways and capital maintenance. So, there has been guidance provided to the council that you will now kind of work through in a budget process for how to allocate and how much to allocate to these areas. So if you break down the sales tax into the council share, and the next slide is about the county share. So first of all, we need to start using the sales tax this October. You voted on a couple weeks ago to approve it to start October 1st. And that's when we become responsible for 100% of the operating costs of the transitways. And so we have transitway operating costs this budget year and then all of next year. So we'll be using our operating budget to show where that funding is and how the sales tax and any other revenue sources for operating. But that is now will be in the council's budget. So, that in 23 and 24, that's existing transitways. Blue line, green line, orange line, ABRT, red line. So it's those transitways. But that existing operation is, next year around $60 million of total cost that we'll be assuming that had been counties. But that, of course, is going to grow over time. 2025, we're bringing on 3 BRT expansions into our system. And 2027, the Green Line extension is opening. The Blue Line extension is opening later in the decade. So that operating cost for transitways is definitely going to grow over time. And so our forecast needs to think through what that growth is. And now we're fully responsible. In the 13 areas, there's a lot of questions like how will decisions be made? There isn't one process we will point to about how you'll make decisions. There's a variety of engagement methods that exist today or will be developed. For example, our budgeting for operating and capital, that's an annual budgeting process that will make determinations of where we're investing in and how much in each of the 13 areas. There were several questions about when are we going to resume service that we idled or cut back during COVID. Well, you're going to hear on October 4th an update on the network now, which is really like, what is our service plan coming out of COVID for the next 5 years? When are we going to restore service, or where should we add service? That is an eligible cost for sales tax. And so that has its own process that you'll be involved in. We identified the arterial BRT corridors through letter H. In 2025, we'll be starting an update to that plan to identify the future corridors after that. And so there'll be a separate planning process that shows where the ABRT expansions will go. The TPP that you're adopting next year has regional performance standards that really kind of show which routes are meeting regional performance standard, where there's opportunities to grow local routes and regional routes. This council has adopted a zero-emission bus plan that will be implemented. For sure, the sales tax allows us to meet that plan that was adopted. And you'll see that reflected in the CIP process where we do the procurement of the electric bus. But we are able to accelerate to meet our plan for electric bus with the sales tax. We didn't have that option. We had a desired plan, but not a funded plan before. And if that's a choice, we can fully fund that plan that was adopted. So there was a planning process for the zero-emission bus plan that the council participated in, and we had envisioned using sales tax to implement that plan. Of course, there's the regional planning. We're in the middle of an update to the TPP where you'll seek input on where transit investments should go, and that will be reflected in that. Our regional transit providers clearly have a vision for what they want to expand their system or grow their system or change their system. So that's an input. And there'll be, to be determined, but robust engagement and public comment periods where you get input on how to invest that new revenue growth where that's available. And so there's a lot of decisions but separate different processes that you'll have afforded to you of how to allocate the sales tax. And then the last bullet is really sort of where Councilmember Johnson was asking about is like there's opportunity for new visions, new corridor plans that go through a local planning process first, where they maybe pick a corridor, pick a route or mode. It goes into our TPP. It goes through that development cycle. And of course, there can be new corridors that have not been in the TPP, and that, that's an opportunity for the council to use sales tax for in the long term as those start their journey into a new project.
I'd like to just point out, Nick, on this slide, a small bullet point, but it's a large number, operating and capital budgets. We had a structural deficit that was pretty substantial over 10 years, well over $1.5 billion. So this new regional sales tax really covers and sustains not just our future aspirations, but frankly, our current operations.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's really kind of the first use of the sales taxes to make sure we have a balanced budget for those, for our current needs. Now, as the chair mentioned, the counties will have significant new revenue sources available to them for a couple ways. Their share of this new sales tax distributed to the counties, but also their relief from the operating expense gives the counties a revenue that they can reinvest in transportation. Each county will define through their own processes how they'll allocate those, whether they'll allocate it to transit or other transit investments. The 17% sales tax was defined on how that had to be, the counties had to go about that. Defined as on the screen here, it had to go 41.5% for active transportation and corridor safety studies, 41% to repair and preserve and rehab the systems that are there on our network to really maintain transportation in a state of good repair. And then 17% of that for transit purposes. We have not seen yet what each individual county is thinking about how to allocate that. It could, there's a lot of variety of they could do. They could do new capital, they could be operating. It's not restricted to operating or capital, so there's a tremendous amount of flexibility, but it's new transit or new investments in transit beyond what we also are investing. So it'll be important to watch that and work with the counties as our partners to understand where their priorities will be for transit investment. But that's a new revenue source to transit, which is exciting. And a key part of the legislation too is this is not just an offset for the counties. It is in addition to what they were planning to invest. So we'll, there's more to come on that at each individual county, and it's decided at the county level. So we'll watch and update as that becomes apparent. So I'll pause there if there's any more questions. We're going to transition to the projects, but if there's anything more about the new revenue side.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You talked a little bit about this on the council share side, but I also want to hear it from the county side, where you talked about pretty detailed, gave us some numbers about the increases in operating costs and knowing that they're increasing from 2027 into the future. So what approximately, ballpark, know that these numbers are evolving for Blue and Green Line in the out years, but how much relief is being provided to the counties from the relief on operating and maintenance for these transitways?
Chair and council members, so I'll start with the maintenance because that is an easier one because the counties didn't have responsibility for capital maintenance. There is some kind of discussion about what before this session, what the Hennepin County's responsibilities were for Green Line extension capital maintenance. I think that was an unresolved issue, but that was an outlier. So from an operating standpoint, next year, I believe there was around $60 million of relief, growing 3.15% for, that is how their budget was capped at growth each year. So existing lines, they capped at 3.15% growth. And then, I don't want to quote numbers because I don't have them here, but, as we add, the counties were going to be responsible for half of Gold Line in 2025, Purple Line, Orange Line, we still have to reach agreement on, had to reach agreement on that, but that was in the 60 million. But Gold, Purple, Blue, and then Hennepin County was responsible for 100% of the operating costs of Green Line extension. which that project in 2027 was in the $30 to $40 million range, probably on the opening year for that project. That becomes a council share. So, I think growing to, on an annual basis, well over 100 million per year by the end of the decade, relief that is part of the council's now responsibility.
Thank you. I appreciate the detail on that very much. And I think, it's good for all of us to understand that, yes, this is an offload from the county, and it is something, an expense that now we will be taking on, but now we do have the sales tax, to the chair's point, that we have additional revenues that help provide us the ability to do that. And I think in the long run, having the operations and some of this all on one entity instead of trying to negotiate agreements every year is probably a good thing. But I just want to make sure everybody understands that, yes, in the long run, better for planning, I think, but there is definitely impact to what we're spending and what the county is relieved of.
Any other questions about the new revenue?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
And Nick, just on the agreements that we have with our county partners, where it's capped at 3.15% of growth, which is problematic when we are having inflationary issues like we've had. I know I think, had some difficulties with that on Hennepin County for Southwest Green Line Extension. So are those locked in, or are we able to manage that piece of it at all?
Mr. Chair, council members, so a little bit of history about 3.15. So 3.15% is an operating growth rate. So that had been, in general, our historical growth rate of our operating budget for transitways for a long time. And so when we were negotiating with the counties, our funding agreements for transitways, they asked for, we wanted a mechanism to grow the operating budget annually as costs grow. And so we looked at historical averages and said 3.15% is a good basis to budget from for growth of the operating budget. And that held for quite a while. But in recent years, that we have exceeded that. However, we had signed a master operating funding agreement with our county partners at 3.15%. We sought to reopen that and renegotiate that, but there wasn't a requirement that they did, and they chose to stay at 3.15%. But now that doesn't matter.
Right.
Now it's our responsibility to manage our growth rate because they're now no longer in the operating part of the budget. Capital growth rate is different. I'll use the Blue Line Extension. Hennepin County is the local funder for the Blue Line Extension capital. The council is not involved in the capital funding of that project, and we are protected from being involved in that if we sign the capital grant agreement. And so the growth rate of that, the budget for Blue Line Extension, when we release it next year, will be larger than it was when we developed the budget for in the 2018, 2017, because of time, 10 years later, and a different alignment and different modes. But that is a responsibility for the growth of the budget there is the county's responsibility because they fund the local portion, and the federal funds, we're hoping to have up to 50% of the project funded federally, but that is hasn't been determined yet. And so we are not exposed to the risk of growth in the capital side of a transitway because we're not a funder. ABRT is an exception. There's a more complicated formula for ABRT involving bonding and sales taxes and eligible use. So, growth on that ABRT program is one we obviously we have some exposure to. So hopefully that answered. But that 3.15 was really about the operating cost, not capital.
Thank you.
And not relevant now that we are funding
Right.
it ourselves. Any other questions? Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You mentioned the zero-emission bus transition plan and how this is one of the priorities for the new sales tax. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if I recall correctly from when we passed that last February, the first milestone for that plan is 20% of our buses be zero-emission electric, most likely, which translates to about 100 to 130 buses.
Correct.
Understanding that we have a few EVs now, that's a lot of buses to meet by 2027, the first milestone. And understanding that those buses cost probably $1.5 million, roughly, million plus, plus the charging infrastructure, which is also hundreds of thousands, millions. And understanding that we're going to be getting 400 million approximately per year for this sales tax. Can you say, and I think I heard you say this, but can you say with really 100% certainty that money won't be an issue for purchasing or for meeting that first milestone with our zero-emission bus transition plan?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, great question. I can say that our capital improvement plan draft that we'll bring forward will fully have that funded at the levels in the plan. Prior to the sales tax, we would not have been able to do that. Clearly, we did not. We had been seeking funding legislatively, federally, but we were not able, we knew how many we wanted to buy, we did not have enough capital. So the plan that will be brought forward for comment, whether, it's council's decision whether you want to fund that plan. That's the budget process, but we will bring forward funding the zero-emission bus plan over the CIP horizon, which is a 6-year horizon, which really matches up well with the zero-emission bus plan, because the other part was we will think about it in 5-year increments, because we want to see whether the technology evolves, and especially the first 5 years, we want to understand how it works for our operations. Now, one of the challenges in the next 5 years will be, can we procure that number of buses? That is the marketplace challenge right now for electric buses. It's not a capital on our side, it's can we secure enough buses to meet what we would like to budget for? And that is a real challenge that we will face, and we'll be happy to talk about that. But that's probably the one, the limiter is the marketplace, not necessarily what's proposed in the capital budget, which is great news. I mean, I think the council adopted that plan hoping we could implement that plan. And this new regional tax is a good example of being able to get a priority of the council move forward.
Thank you.
Also, just on that point, there is the IIJA funding made available. We can use these funds of our revenue stream as matching funds. We don't have to go to legislature for a specific appropriate allocation. So, but as Nick says, we have other issues associated with supply.
We will be aggressive in trying to seek more IIJA funds for electric bus, because that just frees up other funding for other priorities too. So, and we've been fairly successful as a region securing electric bus grants.
Any other questions on financing?
All right, so I'm gonna talk, some now about the Green Line extension. This is a graph that we've been using for a couple of years to talk about, we'll talk in a little bit. I'll talk about the proposed agreement with Hennepin County, which really sort of marks the end of a process that we started January of 2022, when we came to the council saying there is a significant need for increased budget for the project. We had encountered significant issues with the civil construction that was going to impact the overall project budget. In January of 2022, we talked about where we want to enter settlement agreement negotiations with our civil contractor to kind of get us a path to complete the project. We had determined that there were 34 months of delay that we needed to negotiate with our civil contractor due to a few main issues that we've talked about several places in the past 2 years. The addition of the barrier wall for the freight rail, some station additions in Eden Prairie, and also just our major delays with the Kenilworth Tunnel and the addition of the secant wall. Overall, that had, at the time we started talking about the need for additional budget for the project, we had forecasted a 34-month delay at that point. And we reached a settlement agreement as step one with that. About the same time, we encountered new delays. We had issues with the secant wall in the Sika Condo Association that caused another stoppage of work. So even what we were talking about in terms of needed budget, we knew was going to grow because of further delays. And civil is before our systems contract, so delays to the civil contract was going to cause delays to the systems contract, which is the other large contract for building a light rail system. And so we've been talking about we needed to negotiating strategy on civil to have a settlement, so we know what the budget is for that, and then systems. Each civil and systems have a little bit different frameworks for how we've settled them, but we've tried to really manage financial risk to the council within those settlements. So in both systems and civil, we have a maximum exposure, a cap that was negotiated and approved and talked about through various business items here. So we are managing the financial risk through that effectively. But we knew the budget was going to grow. We've been working on that budget increase with the council and Hennepin County and our federal partners since January of 2022. The agreement that I'll talk about inside is kind of the end of that. This agreement is, if you need to think about the budget agreement and funding agreement for that budget as a series of phases. We've been adding funding as we've identified it. You know, this council has approved CRISA funding for that as a step, and last year some 5307 funding for the project. Hennepin County has added funding to it. The financial agreement that we'll talk about is really the last component of that. So once we settle the civil and the systems agreement here, we're very close on that. We'll know what our final number is on those. We have our cap and our range. We also need to complete our updates to our consulting contracts and right-of-ways. And the last component of the revised budget will be the new contingency that we develop to make sure that when we develop or when we adopt a new budget for the project, it is the budget we need with contingency to complete the project. So that's our goal. The budget is not necessarily how much money we're going to spend. It's how much we want to budget to make sure we complete the project and have revenue enough to complete the project. So that's what the budget is. So we'll be adopting that, and I'll talk more in detail. And then we continue to estimate, and we will estimate our revenue operations in 2027. And the budget is built off of that opening day. So as we've built this, you know, we've been, in January, we talked about a funding gap of, January of 2022, a funding gap of $450 to $550 million, a gap. We publicly talked about that. That was before we had to stop work on the Kenilworth Tunnel because of the secant wall in Sika for 10 months. So that risk was not in that 450 to 550. This spring, and so we had found revenue sources to start moving that gap down. So in this spring, through the report from the legislative auditor identified, and we had concurred with a funding gap of $272 million at that time, which didn't include startup costs, which I'll talk about, and didn't include our negotiation for that delay on the secant wall. But that was a number we were working towards. So that's the starting point. When we build this new budget that we're entering with, we're developing a scope, schedule, and budget to propose to FTA to complete this project. We will then go into a comprehensive risk process led by the FTA to make sure that we have sufficient contingency to manage the risk that is identified. So that isn't necessarily contingency we will spend, but it's the risk we need to have. So the new budget will be above that $272 million to have contingency for that and for that secant wall delay. Now, where are we at with risks? By the end of 2023, prior to adopting this new budget, a substantial proportion of the civil project will be completed. We've said 2023 was a key year huge portions of the of the overall project for civil are going to be completed this year. The western half has been turned over to systems. Major bridges that outside in downtown Minneapolis to Glenwood Avenue, probably one of the more complex bridges over the railroad near the Target Field, will be completed within the next month. We are removing substantial risks in 2023. However, one major risk remains, and that is the Kenilworth Tunnel. We should be a little over 50% done at the end of this year. That risk remains high, and we have been many times realized risk on that tunnel. And so we will continue to carry a lot of risk on this project, really tied to that tunnel and working through. But a lot of progress has been made on the tunnel this year moving forward. And so that's kind of the framework of thinking about, before we talk about the deal, some key elements of the budget. But I'll pause there as we have a question.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Nick, for this review of, where we're at with the remaining funding that is needed for the Southwest Light Rail project. I do have questions about the Kenilworth Tunnel in terms of wanting more detail about the timeline for completion, what our obstacles have been in the past with building that tunnel and making sure that that structure is stable, and wanting to know a little bit, having a better picture of what getting to 100% done looks like.
Chair,
You or
Councilmember.
someone else speak to
No.
that?
That's a great question. So we anticipate being done in 2025 with the civil portion of the tunnel that allows then the systems to put this technology within the tunnel. But really, the key risk is completing the civil portion in 2025. We've made enough progress in 2023 that schedule is still holding well. The two major things that have extended that, we've had two major stoppages of work on the tunnel. The first was due to the requirement to redesign a portion of it to add what is called a secant wall for a portion of that. So that caused nearly a year delay to the work on the tunnel. And then in 2022, we had the issues with movement within the Sika condos, which are adjacent to the secant wall area, which we stopped work to find out what the cause of that was and if any work needed to be done on that. And so those were probably the two largest delays caused to that tunnel. But that secant wall is completed. We've been working around the Sika towers now for a better part of 2023, and progress is being made strongly. So, it points to good signs, but the fact that we've encountered problems in the past in the tunnel and we're roughly 50% done with civil work means we want to carry a lot of risk with that. Not because we know a risk is going to occur, but just because past history and tunnels are complex. And so that's why. But, we are meeting our milestones this year to be completed in 2025. That's the last piece of the civil contract is the tunnel. All the pieces around it leading up to the tunnel will be completed before that tunnel is complete.
Oh, Chair, if I might.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. That does really help to see why we don't have a whole lot more detail about the timeline in finishing that. And it looks like because of the past risks and some of the constraints or obstacles, we want to leave room for future needs to address or mitigation to address completing that tunnel. But I think it is something that we should look at closely. And as a council, I think it's something that we probably want to watch and get reports on it periodically, the progress.
Chair and Councilmembers, that is, when I mentioned the FTA risk process, I anticipate a lot of discussion in that structured professional risk process. It involves a lot of technical and engineering work, and so we can, and then from that we'll build a contingency around that tunnel risk. And so we'll be happy to point, and that can be reported out to the council as part of our budget process. And so that's a good point. We can definitely point to how we've allocated contingency within the budget.
Thank you.
Councilmember Barber?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that one of the big steps as we're submitting this recovery plan to the FTA is both council and Hennepin County will have to take action, I believe, on what some of that information is in probably January. Is that correct?
Chair, Councilmember, yes, we will adopt the budget, and then we need resolutions of support for those that are funding the budget, which of course would be the council and as the owner of the project, and the Hennepin County as a local funder.
Councilmember Johnson?
On that point of resolutions of support, so I just want to be clear, because one of the questions I had at the meeting when this all came up at our last regular council meeting, the Met Council put out the release that said that a resolution had been agreed to. And yet, you know, for me, it was important that, would that come then to this council and to Hennepin County Board for approval? And Mr. Chair said that yes, it would. Although afterwards, I spoke with staff and there was like, well, not really. It would probably come in the form of budget amendments then in 2024 as they would move forward, which I understand that will have to happen as well. But there was, I think, some uncertainty maybe and in real time as to how we would, I think, ratify or approve. And so what I'm seeing on the next slide, and I can wait for it, just so that, I think it's important that before, I would say before communications go out to the world, and especially from Hennepin, or excuse me, Met Council, that, you know, the council members themselves don't read in the paper or online or wherever that, oh, it's been reached. Not everybody, I think, was briefed in a way that would give them advance warning. So I think it's just important that this council have time to absorb and understand what we're doing tonight. So thank you to everybody who voted to give us this extra time. And for those of you who didn't, I understand you're here today with good questions too. But this is exactly the kind of thing that I think we need as a council to govern properly. I don't think we've always been afforded that, not out of any malice, but just that. I think it's a bit of the way the culture works at the Met Council. So I just want to be sure that, and coming out of tonight, I would like to find out when it is that we would be voting on this agreement that is on the next slide, so that we have in our own minds a time that we can point to the future and say, okay, the vote will be taken. If I have any other questions, I can ask them and be fully informed before I vote.
Our hope and expectation would be to clarify that we're not waiting until next year, and that there will be an opportunity for it. But we're going to go through what the framework for that agreement is, subject to that approval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So the framework that we talked about and announced, so a little bit more detail about that. So this is about the remaining gap in the proposed budget for the project would be split. This is the capital gap for the complete the construction and needed elements like right-of-way and consultants for capital to complete that project. Split 55% to Hennepin County, 45% to the Metropolitan Council. Hennepin County has indicated they would use their local transportation sales tax for their share. Met Council would use 5307 funding. And then startup costs, which are, and we can get into detail about what's in startup costs, but that is a non-capital. That's like hiring of staff, training as you prepare in advance of opening the service as a startup cost, is Met Council responsibility. So what does that mean? So 5307, that's up, you know, in that where we're working, you know, we haven't proposed the scope, schedule, and budget yet, but we're saying that's up to $150 million, up to, for the council, over 3 years from the 5307 standpoint. Now, you know, knowing that we will propose a budget that has contingency that's greater than, you know, 45% of that $272 million announced gap from spring is about $122 million. So,
Could you repeat that, Mr. Chair?
So
Could you repeat
the
that?
slide before I said, in the spring, we had said there was $272 million remaining at least in the gap. So if you apply 45% to that, that's $122 million for the county, or for the council. Now, we will be proposing a budget larger than that because we want contingency in our budget that we finally adopt in January. So up to 150, 45% is up to 150 million for the council. So kind of thinking through, we have not finalized what that draft budget is, but that seems to be about where we'll be. Now, working with Hennepin County, you know, we were working a rounded number that has our up to 150. So, but, you know, let's play devil's advocate. This project has had a history. What if we exceed that? You know, 3 years from now, something else occurs that we need additional funding. What is our agreement if we exceed that? And so if, in the unlikely event, we exceed that, then we just split the cost with the county, between the council and the county, 50-50 at that point. I'm not saying we are going to exceed it, you know, and it's very unlikely the proposed budget will exceed the up to 150, but we're entering a process that the FTA can say, you need more contingency. And, you know, there's other inputs that we don't necessarily, you know, we got to make sure that the budget the council adopts in January is a budget that we're confident has enough funding in it to complete the project and have sufficient contingency. So, you know, it's the last time we update the budget. And so, you know, that's why we sort of have a split above the 45% for the, in the unlikely event that budget needs to be exceeded. So, the way the project, you know, we are in 2023, we're going to finish the project in 2027. And so how we spend, we have available contingency currently in the budget. And so what we, you know, what this deal allows us to do is work through cash flow to get us through to 2027. We believe we will be able to add the council and the county commitment over a 3-year time period based on our cash flow needs. The benefit of that, spreading that out, is that if we do not need, you know, we don't, all the risks are not realized, or we complete our settlement in a positive way, lower number than we budget, kind of plan for, we will in the 3rd year not be able to need, or not need to use, tap into all those potential up to 150. So we'll be kind of, that's where the decisions of adding to the budget, there's a overall budget you'll be approving in January for the project, but how it gets implemented is through different budget processes over 3 years. So I will pause there before moving to the next, if there's questions about that.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, for everybody here and at home listening, 5307 funding can be used for what?
5307 is federal funding that is earned by our region for, in a formula that's distributed not just to Minnesota, but to all states that have transit systems. We use it, it comes to the region and then is distributed between Metro Transit and MTS. MTS distributes it to regional providers and also Metro Mobility. And so it gets by those that are transit operators or builders in the region are the ones that generate the formula funding through that. It's generally used for capital expenditures. In the past, like last year, we used money on Green Line Extension funding. We've used it on Hiawatha Blue Line. We use it for for bus replacement, capital maintenance. MTS uses it often for bus replacement. Suburban they use it for bus replacement in their program. So it's more on the capital side. It's fairly flexible source, and it's an eligible source for an expenditure like this for capital investment.
And Mr. Chair, just to follow up, so this would be money that, aside from being moved into this gap that we need to fill, this would be money that would be going across the region, including potentially, I think I heard you say suburban providers as well. It would be that kind of money that we could systematically program in all of the things you listed?
Chair and Councilman, the program funds here are the ones that were going to Metro Transit, not to the suburban providers. So
Okay.
the MTS portion of 5307, which is where the suburban provider kind of accounting of the 5307, that is not part of this.
I thought I heard you say suburban providers.
Well, they receive, the region receives 5307, then we sub-allocate it. Metro Transit gets a large portion of that, and that's the portion that will be towards this agreement on Southwest, not the suburban providers.
That money won't go then to Metro Transit needs because it will be moved into this gap funding. Okay, just making sure I heard that right.
Now, you know, the way, as we bring forward the capital improvement budget, you know, we are adding significant funding to our capital improvement budget, where 5307 funding is. You will see a capital improvement budget that is about, taking out transferways, is about 35% larger than last year's capital improvement budget. And so there are no projects being cut from the capital improvement budget for this. There are projects being added to the capital improvement project because the significant new investment of regional dollars in this, from the sales tax, so.
Mr. Thompson, it would be safe to say that without the sales tax revenue coming to the Met Council, it would be difficult to make this kind of commitment. But since all these funds are now covering both operating and capital costs going on to the future, that gives this more of an opportunity to designate these funds.
Correct.
Although, in a sense, whatever would have been covered by 5307 funding in the past or in the future would be covered by sales tax revenue.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
So on that point, first of all, I remember 4 years ago when I got on the council that you made the point that oftentimes federal funds are really prescriptive. You know, you can't use light rail funds to fund road projects or road projects to fund whatever. So it's really pleasant to hear that with these 5307 funds that they're pretty flexible. And we often use them for capital funds, like you just mentioned. And I learned that you can use them for a wide variety of things, including safety improvements. And in thinking about our 40-point safety plan, I bet you 40 out of 40 have some dollar sign associated with it. You've already answered my question about the zero emission bus plan, and that we have funds for that. One thing that surprised me 2 weeks ago is to learn, and correct me if I'm wrong here, or we are wrong here, that about 65% of these 5307 funds will go for this agreement, 65%. But what I think I'm hearing you say is that that will be made up for with this sales tax, that there won't, I guess it was surprising for me to hear that we'll have 65% taken away for 5307, but that won't impact any projects that would have normally been funded through this source of federal funds. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that all of those projects, be they a capital project or a safety improvement project or a gazillion other things, those will be made whole through the sales tax or other sources of funds, perhaps. Am I hearing you correctly on that?
Chair, council member, yeah, well, let's unpack that a little bit.
To shorten my question is
Yep.
like, if we take away 65%, is there anything that we are not going to be able to fund across the region because of that, because of this funding agreement?
There is no project in our CIP that is being cut because of this agreement. We are adding projects to our capital side and adding to the operating side. 5307 is a very flexible capital source. The sales tax is a extremely flexible operating or capital source. It's probably the best revenue source we've had for transit because it can fund anything in our safety plan, be it a capital investment, a labor, investment in labor, anything in our 40-point plan. You know, that sales tax is really flexible for that. Whereas 5307 is more aligned to capital investment only. So if we wanted to invest in increased police force, example, 5307 couldn't be used for that. Sales tax can. Sales tax can also be used to invest in station improvements, environmental design around a station that are safety focused. But this revenue source, I can't emphasize it enough, is the way to think about its impact on the capital program is to look at how big our capital program was last year. When it comes forward to you, I'm not saying we're presenting it today, but it's a 6-year forecast. This new 6-year forecast, taking out transit ways, which are just kind of their own funding source, but just the basics like shelter repair, repair of existing state of good repair, replacement of buses, addition of fleet, that CIP will be 35% larger estimated in the draft. That's a draft that we'll be presenting to you, not necessarily what gets adopted. I'm not saying that's the final. But that just tells you right there that this new revenue source can allow us to build a world-class transit system and complete this funding deal. The 5307, that our capital program has a variety of sources in it. And our financial team allocates it what's best for a variety of reasons. Like, to make it simple, they say, well, it's eligible for 5307, let's put 5307 on it. But really, what they look at is all the revenue that's available for capital, and then make decisions on that, and then align where it gets assigned based on how it is best to account for it. So to simplify, try to behind the scenes. But the overall dollar value of the capital investment is probably where to focus rather than overall of 5307, because it's much larger than 5307.
Councilmember Vento.
Did Councilmember Barber have her hand up before me?
She's spoken twice, so why don't we start with you, and we'll go to Councilmember Burke.
I may be taking this a little off track, and I apologize if I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Councilmember Barber. Nick, I'm concerned about the stability of the 5307 as the federal government is increasingly becoming a pretty stressful place to be as it relates to the budget and the potential for a government shutdown in the next few weeks or months. And I'm concerned about both the short-term impact, but also the long-term impact if budget resolutions result in funding cuts to programs like 5307 or other federal transit-related resources. And I'm curious as to how closely we're watching that and how much we know about it and how big a risk we're at as it relates to those federal funds. I think we're in uncharted waters. I think we're on the verge. It certainly won't be a repeat of January 6th as I remember it, but I think it will be as potentially, if there is a government shutdown, as stressful and dire a moment fiscally and socially for this country as we've seen in a long time. Those of us who remember previous government shutdowns can remember a lot of anxiety about them, and I think this, if there is one, will be unlike anything we've seen.
Chair and Councilmember, we're very aware of the potential there. So a couple points to that is, we have experienced government shutdowns in our budget process many times before, unfortunately. So we will deal with that in the short term. There's strategies for that. In terms of the 5307 itself, IIJA was a significant new investment. One of the big parts of IIJA was it increased formula funds for transit, including 5307, which is about 30% higher than it had been going out. It just raised it 30% per year and is going out. So this is a really strong source of transit revenue. And it's a very bipartisan source of revenue. 5307 goes to every state and has been a very historically extremely stable source of revenue in the past, but I can't predict the future. In terms of how this deal is structured, it's spread out over 3 years. Any short-term disruption in federal government, I don't expect would have a long-term impact on the structure of this agreement because, I have faith and hope that they'll resume at some point, and then we will be able to tap into this source, which has been a very stable source because it's formula. It's not an earmark fund, it's a formula fund. If that answers, maybe reduces your stress a little on that issue.
Mr. Chair, if I could just follow up.
Sure.
I would guess that being that we're 14 months from a presidential election, that IIJA has a big target on its back. Just wanted to note that.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, our questions tie together pretty well. So, and you may have kind of answered part of it. So, looking at the 5307 funds, the ones that went to Metro Transit last year wasn't quite $50 million. So is this anticipated first into the future to be increased with the 30% increase? And is that where your numbers are coming from for that?
Mr. Chair, councilors, the 30% is already in the estimates. Metro Transit doesn't quite get $50 million of the allocation per year, but we have 5307 that we can manage to $50 million per year through arrangement of Metro Transit grants. We can spread that within 4 federal years, which are 3 council years. There are ways to spread this there is no plan to change the allocation that is between, for example, the MTS side of the ledger and the Metro Transit. We can manage to $50 million per year up to, and we may not need the $50 million. It's an up to 150 number, and hopefully we manage the risk of the project. And we were going to catch a break at some point on this project, and so it may be less than we even need from a Metro Transit allocation.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick follow-up to it, I agree. I think we deserve a break, so that would be good. With the 5307 funds, one of the things is because they are federal funds. I agree they are flexible, and this suits this purpose. One of the big is you have to meet the federal requirements to use them, which this does, buying buses does, things like that. But these changes will have to be reflected in our tip, and will have to go through TAP. And is it going to go through as one amount or $50 million per year?
Mr. Chair, Councilman, I guess we haven't worked out exactly, but it's going to go through as over 3 years. Whether we bring that, the TIP's annual, but looks out over 4, we haven't quite worked out if we bring that through as just when the TIP is adopted, like you recently adopted the TIP for 4 years, or is it 5? And so we'll try to make it so it's as simple as possible and transparent as possible how we're bringing it through.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Venta.
Okay, this is my second turn. and then
No,
I'll-
no.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What financial risk is there for us as a council as it relates to the condo dispute?
I can answer that.
Yeah.
You go
No,
ahead.
go ahead, Chair.
I will just say a big picture, and you can fill it in. We've had ongoing kind of mediation, which is very voluntary, with Justice Blatz, kind of bringing sides together. We have made some payments. The project has made some payments. And most importantly, to ensure that the kind of the structural integrity of that building is in good shape. So when I think about where we were and where we are, we've gotten through the most kind of difficult part, which is building that secant wall inches away from their structures. There's vibration, there's continuing disruption. I feel really badly for my neighbors, but we're through the worst of it. There's now excavation of soils, so that's noisy, but it's less risky to the building. And with probably the riskiest portion is the structural parking right next to it. But I think we can't really make a full settlement to the project until kind of they finish all that work. But I think, as I understand it, the most important thing is that it didn't stop the project, which would have been much more expensive and devastating in terms of cost of the project. So the project continues to manage. They did cause some delays rebuilding this secant structure, which secant walls which did cause some delays, and it's more expensive, but I think that is mostly behind us. And I'm actually very optimistic we're going to be able to have a complete, I say friendly, no litigation, nobody wants to sue each other. We're kind of meeting, I think almost meeting weekly. I'm looking at the body language here says, yes, I haven't said any lies yet. So I feel actually we're going to get through that, as difficult as it's been, with no further delays or excessive costs.
And Mr. Chair, if there are additional costs, or when there are additional costs, is that built into our projections or budgeting? Or how does that work?
Chair, Councilmember, we will build contingency for risks like that in the budget. There's contingency for things, and that would fall within our contingency budget.
Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit, I mean, we talked about the structure deal, but there are benefits to this, significant benefits to the council and to the region of this agreement. You know, we now have a path to complete this project. We've been working on this, getting there since 2022. It doesn't require us to adopt a budget. It's a framework that gives us certainty. That is a tremendous, tremendous benefit to the project, to the council, to the region to have this. That's why we need this agreement. So it's unexplainable how much this benefits so many things to have this. You know, it does increase the county's investment in this project beyond what they said they would invest. And so, you know, they weren't required to invest more in this project. They are investing more. The certainty that this allows is not just for this project. You know, it guarantees we will finish this project and start to get the benefits of this project. A tremendous amount of new riders will come into our system on this project when it's open. We're seeing unbelievable development around this project, but you know, that development really wants this project to open. This agreement allows us to finish the project. FTA had told us, you need to get certainty around this budget. This allows us to tell FTA we have a solution, and so you can continue to invest in our region, in the Blue Line and other projects. It's a very strong signal it sends to FTA that we have stable funding to complete this project, which is the commitment they were looking for, and this will meet their needs for their commitment. And then as I transition to the Blue Line, you know, we did not want to bring the capital grant agreement forward until we had an agreement on how to fund this gap. And this agreement allows us to complete the Green Line, complete a project and advance the Blue Line extension, and allows us to start moving forward with that capital grant agreement. So there's huge benefits to this agreement to us.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the last line satisfies enterprise risk, which is part of our transit ways advancement policy, which we should really be thinking about here, and I'm sure we are, but we should really be thinking about this. But it says it satisfies our enterprise risk that we work through that policy. And I would say financially, there are other risks to Blue Line, but I think we're talking about funding here.
Yeah, there was the one risk that was communicated over several months is that risk needs to be solved before moving, that one financial risk of the funding gap should be solved before you bring forward the Blue Line. So that one risk, we believe, is solved with this agreement. There are other enterprise risks, and we can talk about those. That remain, but the financial risk of the funding gap of Southwest, which was identified by the council as a high risk that needed to be solved. The agreement allows us to say that risk is resolved.
Mr. Chair, just to follow up, if I
Yeah.
may, on the financial piece of this agreement. So you've talked about percentages, you've talked about some buckets of numbers, the up tos. You've talked about the splits. So is there a number, there was a number that I read in the media, probably like everybody else. We have to be working towards some sort of budget number as we approach January. We must be anticipating it in the budget that we're setting for January, although amendments can come through, we know that. So, you know, where are we at with, I guess, the number that we don't want, you know, we know that there's some work to do yet, but when, whoever was negotiating with Hennepin County, I mean, what was the number that we were trying to make sure that we managed our risk fully? I think the goal here is to have this agreement, know what the impacts are to the region and this project certainly, but also work towards not having to move the goalposts again when it comes to this project.
Correct. And that, Chair and Councilmember, that number is the number in January, because in January, that will allow us to say, we've incorporated the risk that the FDA says is appropriate level of risk, which is a contingency number. We will also have made, I'm fairly confident we'll have completed our settlement side of the agreement, which allows us to have kind of a final number on the civil and the systems. And then the next month, we'll propose a draft scope, schedule, and budget to FDA, but it will not have the risk check on it. So that's why we said our exposure is up to 150 million, because we haven't finalized that number yet. And it's really the January adoption, which is the number we don't want to change, so that we bring to you.
And Matt, so it's important, and when will this council know what that number is? I mean, I know you're going through process. Oh, it doesn't just magically happen overnight. So, you know, when will it go through process so that we know what the splits are? I just, you know, I think everybody's trying to figure out what the number is. And I understand there's some time needed, but I can't imagine that everything was negotiated in a vacuum. So will we get that late this year then, as it starts coming through committee, or will it start to come through committees in January, or when will that happen?
We're saying, Chair and Councilman, January for this committee, so we'll, based on the schedule, we haven't quite mapped that out, but yes, January is the month that we talk about, where the action would be.
But regarding the framework for funding, identifying sources for the gap as we know it, we have the framework that Nick Thompson's described, which allows for that 150 million, which gives some room, that up to number, and then a 50-50 beyond that number. So knowing with greater certainty with the FTA process as to what that additional, if there is any additional funding required for contingency, we'll have that with certainty. But at least at this point, we've identified the sources, which is part of our presentation to the FTA. Councilmember Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your benefits of the agreement, you said it benefits the region, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of benefit to the rest of the region. When this project began, it had money from CTIB, which was 5 counties out of the region. And CTIB ultimately disbanded because the other counties said, all of our money is going to Hennepin County and this isn't a very good deal. Now we're talking about using regional money from all 7 counties to fill our part of the overage. But Hennepin County is little over 40% of the population of the region. They're going to be generating somewhat around that amount of the sales tax that's going to be backfilling for all of this money shifting around that we're doing. But there is no benefit to the other 60 or so % of the region that is having to pay in on this. This wasn't their project. I mean, they did put in some money at the beginning, but Hennepin County decided to do this themselves with no other partners. And each time there's been this covering extra cost thing, we keep chipping in half or more. And I'm really frustrated with this agreement. We haven't talked about, is this agreement a good agreement? It's a terrible agreement. Hennepin County got a whole lot of relief from what they were paying for operating costs, and they're gonna use a little bit of it for this, but the rest of the region is being asked once again to chip in with no say. And that really frustrates me. We should be saying no to this agreement, but we're not talking about that. And I don't know, nobody tells me anything, so I don't know if there has been any discussions with Hennepin County on whether they're insisting that that is the most that they're gonna do and that we have to vote this down to renegotiate. Or is there any discussion on changing this agreement? Because it's a really bad agreement.
I respect your opinion. Any other, did you want to comment? Go ahead.
I do want to just add on to what Councilmember Wolf said, and I think she has come to the heart of this issue, which is, as a body, how do we want to determine how we prioritize projects? We're going to have lots of different county partners, and there are going to be projects that are focused in different areas across the metro, but how do we divide up the resources that we have to benefit the most number of people? I don't have a response, but I do think that this is the heart of the issue and the heart of the conversation we should be having as a body, not just when it comes to this agreement, but to all of the work and investments that we make across our transit system.
Councilmember Carter.
Thank you. I don't have a response to the issue that was just raised, but I do agree with Councilperson Cameron that that is a crux of the issue. Perhaps not whether this is a bad or a good agreement, but in essence, how does this reflect on our ability to consider projects into the future? You know, does this sort of agreement foretell how we would fund other agreements? We haven't talked about those capital funding agreements to come. And of course, we want to be sure that we are able to fairly consider and benefit those agreements, our participation, our partners' participation, to do the work that we prioritize to be done. So I think that is a consideration. We have to tee up how we're thinking about that and what this indicates for the future.
I'll just make a comment. I really agree that this is the crux, and it's a very important question. And I will take responsibility for this deal, which I disagree. I think it's actually a very fortunate and very timely and important arrangement with Hennepin County. And I was very much involved with others from MMD, with others within the governor's office, and certainly with Chair of the Transportation Committee, Deb Barber, early on, when, if you can remember from the retreat, we raised this issues. And the reason I think it's a good deal is because it's one-time cost for something that we owned. Am I happy with it? Anybody here happy with it? No. But we did not have the structure in the Green Line extension agreements that we have now in the Blue Line agreement. We learned our capital funding agreement on the Blue Line has these excess costs, delays, liabilities covered, at least covering our liability, in ways that the Green Line did not. And here's why it's a good deal, because yes, Hennepin County's position was they're zero, they're done. And we have no existing law or financial agreement that would give them any responsibility to pay a dime. So the fact that they're contributing a significant amount and more than Met Council, I think is a great achievement. Would we like to pay nothing? Absolutely. Was that ever going to happen, or would it ever happen? It won't. I promise you, it will not happen. So I've negotiated that on behalf of the council with the help of staff and state budget outside advice. Something so big and fundamental as this, certainly that the governor's office would be involved. They've been very supportive, but I take full responsibility for negotiating that deal, subject to your approval. But it is not one that is open to revision. I promise you, it will only get worse. Because when it comes to the OLA, I'm the one who shows up and represents the ownership of this project and answers for it. When there's issues in the press or there's issues anywhere else about who's managing this project, it's a Met Council project. If there's a funding gap at the end of the day, who are they going to call? They called us. So the fact that we had this amount of significant investment from Hennepin County, I think is an incredible achievement. And I'm happy to take that to any debate anywhere. And I'm happy and fully prepared to talk about that process. But I think we need to recognize it as something we've learned from. We've learned a lot from the Southwest Light Rail that we would do and that we would not do. And a number of things we've learned is to put together a transit advancement policy, which has come into play in these decisions toward the Blue Line. And I think when we think about how we put together project management teams, how we think about budgeting, how we work with our county partners, we need to have our eyes wide open. And I think we're in a different place with very important partners in building really important projects. The regional value of all these transitways is that they're an interconnected system, more than anything. And what happens to favor Hennepin County will favor Ramsey County the following year. We have to make sure that we have a balanced approach to this interconnected system. No question, that's up to us over time. But that gets to the heart of your question of how do we manage this balance and how do we approach it. But whatever cards we were dealt with the Green Line extension, we had to finish the project and we had to do it responsibly. And I think we've done that. And hats off to the project team and others who take a lot of criticism, but are always showing up every day to be smart. And these settlement agreements were a big part of getting us to the point of finishing this project responsibly. And I think part of our responsibility is to step up and work with our partners to identify the funding and do it now, not have it lingering over our heads. And we had the point with this Blue Line decision, which I think everybody supported, to have our transit advancement policy in place to make these important decisions.
Thank you. Mr. Chair.
I know Councilmember Vento, then Councilmember Johnson.
Mr. Chair, I don't envy you and what you've had to endure since you became chair of this council. And I've watched those OLA meetings, and I'm not sure how you sit through them. They've got to be a form of torture, because none of the partners are there getting the heat. And they're the ones that design these plans. They've spent years. They said they were committed. And, you know, you go through this, and we become the big bad decision makers, the irresponsible ones, the ones who should be elected instead of appointed, because if you're elected, you're smarter. I don't buy that theory, and I won't get into the whole governance piece of it, but clearly governance is a factor in a lot of what we're talking about tonight. And it's certainly a factor in the criticism we get. But I got to tell you, I continue to have real serious reservations about our relationship with this particular county and the impact it's having with our other counties. And in particular, the two counties that I currently represent. And I don't blame those counties for being frustrated and pretty damn skeptical about whether or not their needs are being met. Within CDC, in our livable community grants, we have a limit as to how much any one entity can get. And I sometimes think it might not be a bad idea to have a limit as to what any one county can get before the rest of the counties are served. I think it might be worth considering at some point. I'm glad that we have our policy plan in place. I hope we employ it, and I hope we have a robust discussion about those risk factors and whether or not we're all in agreement that the risk factors, as they've been described for the Blue Line, are what we believe they are. But I gotta tell you, I'm not feeling good. And I apologize for that, Mr. Chair, but after 4.5 years, it's hard to read the comment section in the Star Tribune, despite what everybody's told me not to read the comment section in the Star Tribune articles, but I've got to read them. I want to know what our critics are saying about us. And they think that we are the designers, the planners, the visionaries for these projects. And they want to put all of the blame, all of the heat at our feet. And I don't know how this plan changes that for the community.
Councilmember is it Chambliss? Councilmember
I'll
Chambliss.
pass, because I think I've spoken more than
Okay,
Councilmember Chambliss.
go ahead, Reba.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing all the various perspectives, and I especially appreciate hearing your perspective, Chair Zelli, on how this agreement has proceeded, what the issues are, and your responsibility in leadership in the region. I believe that this is a sound agreement, and it brings a solution that our region needs for the Southwest Light Rail project, and we need a solution now. Is it perfect? Well, probably not. But it is a sound solution that I think will allow us to move forward. It has been very clearly illustrated today that we have contingencies in place to make sure that it is a sound agreement and that we will have sound operations and transitway advancement policies and procedures moving forward. That transitway advancement policy is a new policy that we have implemented at the Metropolitan Council, and it is not complete. We can still improve upon that, and some of the comments that our council members have made and how we can advance policies across the region can be addressed through the continuation and improvements in our transit advancement policy. I also appreciate all of the work that has been done by council members who have worked on the transitway advancement policy and staff members, as well as council members that have worked on the risk management framework and staff members for the helping us to negotiate and navigate these large-scale projects that do come with risk. They come with risk inherently. And so addressing that and boldly addressing those risks and managing them is going to allow us to be better regional administrators of the transit funds. So thank you to everyone who has done that. And I think that risk management is just one piece of the puzzle in advancing projects. We need to look at more of how we can advance projects in the region. As we have more resources like we have now, we have the resources to do more and to do better, and that takes us in a good direction.
Can we move, go ahead.
So,
Councilmember
Mr.
Johnson.
Chair, thank you to everybody for having, again, this time tonight to dig into this. We've taken an hour and a half to have more discussion that I think was absolutely necessary, and I appreciate that. Mr. Chair, I know you're in a tough spot, but you don't have to be alone in this spot. I've had to be a sleuth to try to figure out how things have worked, how did we get there, asking questions of multiple people along the way and going, you know, I don't think the whole council really understands this whole picture. So for the fact that we are being open and transparent tonight with daylight on this, which wouldn't have happened had we voted at the last meeting, a lot of the questions and concerns that we brought up tonight were more fully addressed that might have been brought up last time, or new concerns. We as a body are governing, and that is our job. And I will say it again, we are accustomed, I believe, here at the Met Council in my 4.5 years of having a fabulous staff that we work for. We have wonderful partners throughout this region. And at the same time, we as a body, a whole council, cannot get so comfortable with each other that things come to us at, I'm going to continue to say it, the 11th hour, whether it's opportunity or problems. We as a governing body need time to digest, go back to our constituents, go back to our partners that we represent in our districts, and get the feedback so that we know how to fully represent them at this meeting. That is not easy to do when something is posted on a Friday, a memo goes out on a Monday about a deal, and we are going to be meeting in management and transportation just ahead of that, probably without the full information. And it's coming out on split votes. That's not, we can have split votes. In fact, we can agree to disagree. We've done that tonight. But to be informed is very important, and I'm going to continue to beat that drum here at the council, because that is a large part of the criticism coming from the legislature and coming from our constituents and partners. Second of all, I just want to say too, I am requesting, not formally now, but I'm requesting that at our meeting next week, when we bring these items all back together, and we still have to get to Blue Line, and we aren't gonna have enough time probably if we adjourn at 6, because there's a lot to unravel there. Good discussion, I'm sure. But I think at the next meeting, Mr. Chair, it'd be wise that we take our vote on this funding agreement so that we can all move forward to get to the numbers in December, and FTA knows whether this body agrees. If the body doesn't agree, well, then we can deal with that now. To me, it's sounding like there's going to be agreement, if I am a good vote counter based on comment, and I am, because I've been doing this for 20-some years. But I think that's important to signal to us as the extension of the rest of your work, to bring it now back to council and take that vote. So my expectation, and I'll be asking for it formally when we bring up the agenda at our next regular meeting, that we will add that as part of our discussion. So I'll let you decide and the rest of you decide. But I think after tonight's discussion, we can probably decide if we agree, and then everybody can move forward with whatever they need to move forward on. So that's all I wanted to say, and I wanted to, again, appreciate your transparency, Mr. Chair. The last thing I would say is, as a chair of the Management Committee or Transportation Committee or any of our major committees, the leadership group that meets, we are always happy to give parameters from which negotiations take place, because we negotiate a lot through the Management Committee, whether it be with our unions or other things, and we're always happy to provide, you know, and I know you've had people that you've talked to, I'm sure, you know, you've mentioned them tonight, but if you need us to be there in other ways, I'm just offering as Chair of Management that I'm happy to give some insights, and I'm sure others would too. So with that, Mr. Chair, I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Councilmember Johnson. And I do think this conversation has been really valuable, not just for transparency, but for our own thought processes. I know we have more for this presentation, and I really think it'd be valuable for Nick Thompson to kind of talk through the Blue Line. And do you have a little bit on transit advancement?
Yeah, we'll
Okay,
close
so
with the
let's
policy.
and let's try to march through this, maybe hold questions till we finish your presentation, and then we can kind of wrap up. But again, I think we got through some really substantive conversations, so I appreciate that.
So what comes before you next week is the capital grant agreement for the Blue Line extension. And the budget to bring in $75 million from Hennepin County for funding that capital grant agreement. That is to continue the Blue Line, work on the Blue Line extension this year and next year. Very important year for the project that'll allow us to get to the point of seeking municipal consent from the communities on the corridor. And then we will have a new ridership forecast. We'll know about the impacts. We'll know about the cost. So that agreement that we'll be seeking really allows us to move to a very important stage, to see if there's community support for the project, to see if it's justified based on ridership and costs. And that's what we get over the next year. So that, you know, we did get several questions about the mode for LRT. We are planning a light rail transit project, but I know some of the questions last time and through that we've received in the past week were, what about BRT? And so I wanted to just spend a little bit of time on that. We haven't talked too much about BRT on this corridor, but just to frame it, there are three types of BRT in our network that are either being built or operating. We have arterial BRT, the lettered lines that we lead. Arterial BRT is an upgrade to an existing transit route that improves the speed and reliability. Great success in the region. Our highway BRT, most recent one to open was the Orange Line. We also have the Red Line, highway BRT. That is usually funded through federal funding and county funding in the past. Counties do not participate in ABRT. And then what we are currently building is Guideway BRT. The Gold Line is an example of that, which was funded half federal, half by counties. The council does not have contributions to the capital funding of the Gold Line. There's very similar funding and process for light rail project. Of course, then we have Guideway LRT. And so the way you to think about why not BRT on Blue Line is to think about Guideway BRT. That is what would be compared to light rail and what would be here. So this was considered in the environmental process for the previous project in Blue Line 1.0, which was when we had the rail alignment. We started with a universe of alternatives, 21 alternatives, 12 of which were BRT. Narrowed it to 5, 4 LRT and 1 BRT. The recommendation in 2014 was that LRT was the preferred mode from Brooklyn Park to Minneapolis. Then it was by the BNSF corridor, but it was chosen over BRT because BRT has lower ridership, it has limited vehicle capacity, fewer passengers per hour, which basically means we need more operators to transport the same number of passengers. And it actually has a greater impact, community impact. So we would be building a guideway, which is about the same width as an LRT. And if we were to build a guideway BRT on the current alignment of where we're proposing for the LRT, we'd have the same or more impacts to right-of-way, same or more impacts to traffic. We'd have a slower mode of travel, and need several more vehicles and more operators in LRT. So in 2020, we went through the modification for Blue Line 2.0, and LRT was confirmed as the mode. So there's a couple very important things about that. Our local funder, Hennepin County, also confirmed that they are funding an LRT mode. We are in the federal process for LRT. So if we were to consider BRT, that's starting over. That's a new project. There is no doubt we would have the same or more impacts than LRT for a guideway BRT. And a slower, less travel time. It is not right to compare Blue Line LRT to ABRT for a couple of reasons. There isn't an existing route that we'd be upgrading to ABRT like we are doing with C line or D line or B line. ABRT, is also significantly slower. It's not dedicated. It does not have interchanges that bypass signals or have travel time advantages. And so it is not the same mode. So it would have much lower ridership. But it would have less impact. It would not have a right-of-way impacts, less cost. But, Brooklyn Park would not be within the travel shed of Mall of America Airport on an ABRT necessary mode. That's a long travel. It is on LRT. So it has less access, essentially, for the communities than an ABRT. And then also, there is not county funding for that mode of that choice. And so that is really starting over for the project. If at some point, and that point may still come, we have not got municipal consent from the communities yet. And so they get to weigh in on whether they want LRT. And we still don't even know if it's federally eligible yet because we haven't developed the ridership cost and other impacts. So that's what happens in the next year. So there's a lot more certainty about whether the LRT is the right project that occurs in the next year. So now on to the Transway Advancement Policy. I think you're probably going to have this graphic tattooed in your brain in terms of how many times you'll see it and have seen it. But really, our Transway Advancement Policy is 2 phases. It's about entering into the TPP for a project that is locally planned. And then once the council takes over, there are gates that we go through. And then we bring forward to the council before major decisions, the risks to the project. And assigning the capital grant agreement, which is what we'll be requesting next week, is one of those gates. And so we've talked a lot about what the risks are at the enterprise level for the Blue Line. We've shown these risks. We still believe that these risks financial risks have been significantly mitigated compared to where we were when we started enterprise risk process and discussions earlier this year after the policy was adopted. So financial risks have been greatly reduced. Our number one risk remains that we need a significant amount of additional staff for this line, but also for what we're building in the next decade. So we need strategies to keep mitigating that risk. So that is unchanged. That affects both operations, maintenance, safety, and our patterns around that. And then, the Green Line Agreement essentially reduced the outstanding federal funding risk on one of our major transitway, if that's approved. And so some of the financial risks are changed, but the operational risks and community risks remain for this project. Enterprise risks, we are not attempting to eliminate all enterprise risks. There will be risks. So it's really the policies about communicating what the risks are before you make a decision and having that influence your decision about major actions. So, it was mentioned earlier, we're not still not complete with the process about how enterprise risk will work. We've hired a consultant, they're working with us. So this is a new slide to show you, but really they want us, we're starting to frame up areas to think about in terms of enterprise risk. You know, enterprise risks are not about the blue line, it's about the council's risk and how much risk you're willing to take on overall. And so think about it in buckets of risks. There's financial, workforce, there's strategic risks. There's been risks around like, you know, what's the future of transit ridership? Where is it going to go? How are people going to travel? What is technology going to do? There's big risks there. Socio-political risks, you know, brand risks, what our partners are, project governance. These are all risks that are not just Metro. These are ones you can use on transit. These apply to environmental services, community development, as you're making major decisions. But these are the areas we kind of considered when we were developing the top risks on the slide before, were these kind of categories. The process, what we're not at yet is getting really like how much risk, what's your risk tolerance of the council? How much risk are you willing to have? You know, and so, what's an acceptable risk and what is that risk level? And so that's a learning process we haven't fully implemented yet, but this is really what to think about in terms of categories of enterprise risk as you're evaluating whether to approve the capital grant agreement next week. So last slide, timeline of all the decisions coming forward. Next week is the Blue Line Capital Grant Agreement and the budget for it, 2 separate actions. In terms of the overall budget, where a lot of questions were around of can we afford this deal and other things, you know, that is a separate budget process. We're anticipating coming to you in the committee of the whole in October 4th for a robust discussion about the budget and sales tax and what's in the elements and what assumptions are being made, and allow you to answer overall questions beyond what the discussion we had today, a lot more in-depth. Then the capital budget goes to the Transportation Committee on their normal path. We present it to the council as an information item before we come back and ask you to adopt the public draft for public comment. And then, so there's all these places for questions and opportunities. Now, you know, there isn't, once you get to that point, there isn't ability to do major changes necessarily for what's going out to the public draft, but, and this is such a changed year because of this new revenue source. And as I stated, there's going to be a lot of processes that need to influence where the funding is aligned to that, but we still have to adopt a budget. And so they're not necessarily aligned. And, you know, but we're learning about what the sales tax is, what its forecast, and then we need to follow processes to understand where to allocate it. And then we will have some point this fall, the agreement for, that we've discussed, the Green Line Agreement, before the council in some way. And then really, the end of this Green Line is adoption of that budget in January, which we've talked about a lot. It's a very important step for the project, but it's kind of the major milestone, and that's where we'll have the new budget number with risk. We'll be able to really talk about what's in that budget number and how it's going to be funded, and that action will be approved by the council, and at the same time, Hannibal County will need to pass a resolution of support for their share of that in that time frame too. So I'll think that's my last slide.
We covered a lot of material. Thank you, Nick. And I know we had a robust discussion. We probably have more questions, but we have time for a few if anybody has anything else they'd like to say.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I won't talk long, just a request. So one of the questions that I've been getting throughout this process is, we, as a group, did sort of assign the top enterprise risks when they first came out, but the revised version has been revised by staff coming. And so I think there's a desire amongst council members to relook at that as to what should be ranked what should last. And I know, like, we're learning the policy and figuring that out. So that would just be a request, whether it's at a committee of the whole or something like that, where we go through that process again.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will tag along and agree with Councilmember Barber. I would also like the Transit Policy Work Group to get some more bites at the apple on this, because all of the major flashing red lights, flashing orange lights were brought to that group. Staff was very concerned. Again, we are grateful to the governor and the legislature for the new funding, but there are a myriad of other risks, enterprise risks involved with this that I think we need to continue to, hear where things are at, and certainly with our community outreach team on the mitigation, displacement mitigation efforts. I continue to hear more and more and more from people along this corridor that are very concerned about LRT. So I need to just continue to absorb that, and of course, there are proponents for it too. My one question is, I hear the word budget an awful lot. Will and what parts of this will come before management?
Good questions.
Chair and council, the same parts that come every year for committees. There's nothing new in the budget cycle this year. So if, I don't know all what comes before budget committee, but we're not proposing an alternate budget process this year. It's the process for capital and operating budgets that the council has followed in the past. And what's new is there's a new revenue source that will be shared for transportation this year. And other committees maybe has new revenue too, but we will follow the normal budget process for committees that we have in the past.
Thank you, and I'll work with our deputy administrator, who also serves to assist me in the management committee. I think, again, that process is important, but also the more the council members through committees can get their eyeballs on things, that it relates to the work that they do, the better. So I'm going to be pushing for that, and Phil knows that already because we've chatted about it. So I think, again, just making sure that we're open about our process as much as we can be for input from people outside of our walls here would be good.
Councilmember Chambliss.
Oh, thank you, Chair, and I think those are good comments. As council members, I know we're all empowered to ask information on what's brought before us and what's not brought before us, because there's hardly a meeting where I don't do that. So I'm glad that council members are saying that we want information, we take responsibility, and we take our roles very seriously. So at any time, we have the opportunity to talk to our other council members, our staff people, our leaders, including the chair and the committee leaders. And I think this controversy is going to make, and the challenges are going to make us stronger as a council. And so I appreciate this process that we've been going through. I appreciate the hard questions. And I'm going to appreciate the success as we move forward and advance our projects.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And any other comments, questions? Councilmember Johnson.
Mr. Chair, just one other thing. So as we prepare for next week's meeting, because we again have postponed it, all of this will be bundled up to the next meeting. I just am hoping we will allot ourselves enough time. I know we're always on the 4 to 6 timeframe, and I get it that that's the culture here at the council. I will tell you, in local government, it doesn't work that way. You stick it out until you get it all done, and sometimes being constrained. But these are big projects, and so in managing the agenda, and I know you do a great job at that, but we all do in our committees, that there's enough time to really roll up our sleeves, because we need that time, I think, to ask the questions and feel comfortable with advancing it to this next step. I understand it's Hennepin County dollars. I understand that they have a unanimous vote. I understand it will help us get some of the, I think, information that we need as it relates to all of the numbers and the enterprise risk that we face on this project. But we as a council are going to need time to dig in a bit, so I would appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate everybody's comments and those that advance this idea of having a deeper conversation. This deeper conversation is certainly appreciated by everybody. And honestly, we want to have more of that. And this is taken to heart, the idea of not bringing things at the 11th hour. They should be brought for due deliberation and transparency. And the processes, of course, are always not perfect. But I think we have learned along the way, and I think we are stronger given the level of conversation that we're having. Thank you all for the time, but also the passion and commitment to delve deeper into issues which are so important for our region. And it's not that we just love buses or trains, we love providing access to people for an inclusive prosperity for the entire region. And that is something not owned by any particular neighborhood, but all neighborhoods and all Minnesotans. And I think that's what brings us to this table. And honestly, I think about other bodies and jurisdictions. I love the picture of us as diverse geographically, racially, every respect, to think that we together can do the right thing. So, and I know we are. We're heading that way. So thank you all. Stay tuned. We're meeting next week. Please show up. Thank you again for your engagement. And I am in town, so call me if you have any questions. Talk to you soon. Thanks. This meeting's adjourned.